Hello everyone, this is Space Café Podcast and I am Marcus. Hello on the other side. To be honest, I expected more from COP26. No, none of this was a big deal. I feel like I have to agree with Greta here. Not when it comes to intentions and agreements and such, but simply when you look at the time horizons proposed. Sorry, 2030 is too late to start stopping things like emission and deforestation. Why can't we just do it like we did it at the beginning of the pandemic? From one day to the next. Everything was possible, suddenly, to change our lives in a way as we have never known it before. So, we have shown that it can be done if we want. Why don't we just act? Everything is at stake. It's frustrating to see that we just don't do it, even though it would be possible. And it's all about the wrong reasons, we know. No, we do not have to be concerned about the economy. Sorry, guys, that's the wrong argument. We have to be considerate of our planet, which, if it were a human being, would probably be in intensive care. But this patient is too big, too strange, too different for us to develop compassion for, I have the feeling. Do you remember the legendary Earthrise photo that Apollo 8 took and showed mankind for the first time what our own home looks like? The image inspired many, including environmental movements. Maybe it's time for a new image of our world, as we're no longer the same as we were back then. Globalization, internet, connectivity. But the problem is that we are not equipped for it, cognitively. I mean, we are equipped for a local world, but not for a global one. Who knows? Maybe a new generation of satellites will give us just that understanding. An understanding that will help us develop compassion for our home. The conversation with my guest today should have been different, I guess. We should have talked about technology and its latest applications. But suddenly everything changed. And that's exactly why I love these conversations so much. You never know where they will lead if everyone involved is brave enough to leave the beaten path. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you today Stewart Bain, CEO of NorthStar Earth and Space. Let's go.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm Stewart Bain. I'm the founder and CEO of NorthStar Earth and Space, and our mission is to provide information services to monitor and safely help the sustainability of our environments in space and on Earth.
Somewhere I read that you are setting up a space traffic management system. Is that something along your vision?
The short answer to your question is no, we're not setting up a space traffic management system, but we are setting up an information service that allows people to more accurately and precisely and reliably and quickly monitor activities in space that include controlled and uncontrolled objects. So it's a catalog, and it's an accurate catalog, if you want to think of it like a commercial GPS system to help you navigate and monitor activity in space.
Mm-hmm. So let's pull out a little. Why is that important that NorthStar is around?
I think it's important that the companies like NorthStar are around because the answer to a lot of the problems that we're facing right now are systemic. And if you look at climate change, if you look at the challenges we face feeding ourselves and maintaining our own natural resources that we use to survive, which include outer space, they are a system of systems of problems. And if you approach those problems singularly with a single tool, you miss out on the big picture. I'm a little bit preoccupied with a book I'm reading right now by Dr. Ian McGilchrist from All Souls College, who wrote a book, you may have heard of it, called The Master and His Emissary. And it's really about the right hand, left hand side of the brain. It's quite scientific. It sounds like a novel, but it's more scientific. It's like nonfiction about how the right and the left side of the brain work in complement to give us perspective. And what NorthStar proposes to do as a system of systems solution is to help improve our perspective on how we are interacting with our environment with more accurate information. So not just a one-dimensional answer or a single tool, but a system of systems of tools that are driven by information. And what we have at our availability right now in the world is massive computational capability, which we should be leveraging a lot. And what we should be doing is developing algorithms, which NorthStar is doing, but to talk about it generically, developing algorithms that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the client so that making good decisions quickly becomes easier. And really that's what's important.
And can you give me an easy to digest and simple example of a typical service that you're offering, that you're providing?
Yeah, if you're operating a fleet of satellites in space that are, to start with, I would classify them as a high-valued asset. It's operating in space. And you want to make sure it's safe during its operation from collision with an uncontrolled object in any orbit. And because NorthStar will monitor low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, and highly elliptical orbits all the way out to the early touches of cislunar. You need to have a bigger perspective than just looking necessarily at your object. You want to get a picture of space and what could possibly pose a threat to you. And so the service that we would offer is that kind of observation, catalog, and then orbit determination as a service. So determining accurately your orbit and helping you manage your flight plan so that you have great confidence of the location of your satellite at all times, and also what is posing potentially a threat. So a high interest object, an object that is either being controlled or uncontrolled, what's the likelihood it's either going to come and randomly hit you because it's flying through space, or it's deliberately coming to visit you for a not so friendly reason, and you want to be able to be aware of that. You want to be able to predict early warning, these types of potential proximity approaches.
Super interesting. How is this being taken care of right now? Because NorthStar is setting up that service, so I guess it's not happening right now. Or how have people been doing it so far?
They do it right now through sharing data. There's an organization called the SDA, the Space Data Association. They share data amongst operators. They use ground-based systems, ground-based radar, ground-based optical sensors to get technical, with just a telescope on the ground, but very good telescopes on the ground. And they place them around the world, and they essentially wait for objects to pass overhead. So I'm already getting into a comparative analysis. When you're fixed on the ground, you can only see what's above you, and you have to wait for it to pass over. The difference with our system is that it will be launched into space, and it will survey space continuously and see all of the low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, where we have our GPS satellites and other high-valued assets, and then out to geo. It will see all these orbits, and it will give you that perspective. So you're getting potentially multiple views of an object during one single orbital pass of its orbit, and you'll get it from multiple angles because there'll be more than one sensor in space. Hence, as you can imagine, your accuracy and predictability of where objects are going to be increases. And as we occupy space and develop a new space economy, this capability becomes more and more necessary because we need to really be operating safely and sustainably in space.
Is this somewhat comparable to air traffic control on Earth? That now this is somewhat a space traffic control system that you're setting up?
Yeah, our data would be used, our information services would be used in the same way information of the location of aircraft would be used to permit someone to do that service. We won't provide that service. We're not providing space traffic control or space traffic management, but our data would feed into, I would think, more of a government-related organization, because you're making a really interesting point. About 500 meters down the street from my office is the International Aviation, what it is, the OACI, Air Traffic Control Organization. 83 nations in the world subscribe to this organization for the safe management and the safe flying of aircraft. So in the same sense, we're in the same line. And Canada as a location to put this organization is a natural one because we tend to be trusted by other countries. So it's the International Civil Aviation Organization that I was looking for. Okay. So the ICAO, as you might call it, the International Civil Aviation Organization, is down the street from my office. And this organization provides that service. And I think ultimately, collectively, governments and regulatory bodies will be coming together cooperatively to execute such a service. Industry does what industry can do: innovate, move quickly, adapt, provide services. And in the end, managing it and doing the regulatory part comes from those who can do that. And I would say that's more of a government.
I find it utterly fascinating to see how humanity is, I wouldn't say conquering, but maybe let's use that term, conquering space as its new permanent territory. So we don't have any territory left on Earth. So we're moving upward. And by moving upward, we are recreating and revisiting challenges and issues we've been visiting and confronting ourselves with on Earth. And now we need new rules, or we need, in fact, similar rules, but with different technologies in space. Is this something that's going on, that from a two-dimensional space, we're now moving into three-dimensional space, up into space, but we're still being confronted with the same problems?
Yep, very much, Marcus. That's a hole in one in terms of the way you describe it. When you think about a reasonable reference, the historic tragedy of the commons, that was of using common land excessively to the point where it was overused and no longer usable. We have a tendency with technology to dominate with technology. And then there's that's a lot of the subject of what's going on now with climate change, COP26, why we're older, why back in the 70s were certain countries allowed to pollute like crazy, but now we're not allowed to. It says India and China. It's like, we're allowed to industrialize. Our industrialization process is typically accompanied by a significant amount of pollution and disruption to the environment. And space is no exception. The difference, I think, is that somehow in space, we see it differently because we're all flying around through the same orbits, and we end up being in each other's orbits, rather than on Earth, we're limited by maybe your two-dimensional model, where we're stuck in our countries and we think, oh, they're polluting over there, it won't affect me over here, but we all know it does. And so this business of how we impact each other seems to be much more obvious. And the hard part about space is, if we really pollute it too much, cleaning it up isn't an option that has a short time frame. We're talking a long period of time if space becomes inaccessible. You're talking more than decades. You're talking unusable space. And just to make an important point, Adam Jonas from Morgan Stanley pointed out that space is existential to our existence and to our economy. If you think about all the financial transactions that run through the GPS satellites, and the economy of our world runs through satellites, and the communications of our world runs through satellites. And unfortunately, as one of your previous guests pointed out in a nice video on the internet, Marie Bajal, there is no backward compatibility. We can't go back to the dial-up phone. The infrastructure isn't there anymore. We rely on satellites to observe our planet, to manage our planet, and to run our economy. We must protect that environment and keep it sustainable. We can't afford to take a chance with that. So we really have to be out in front of our typical nature, which is to create a mess and then work really hard to clean it up and get it back to where it should be. So that's a big challenge.
What I like about that idea we're discussing here is the fact that maybe we are a different kind of human being than we were before the space age. Because before the space age, we had, or not only the space age, maybe before the age of massive globalization. Because before that, we had a completely different view of the space we live in, the space we use during our everyday lives. Now, in this three-dimensional space, including space up there, we are a different kind of human being. And maybe for that, we need technology to help us understand where we are and get a sensual experience. Because like we, as human beings, we have been evolving for a different planet. Maybe this is a little too over the top at the moment, but it seems like something like this.
No, I think you're making it much more accessible by describing it that way. If you think about coming out of our caves, okay, looking outside of our cave and saying, okay, I think I need to go explore over there and see what's going on over there, because what we've got around here isn't going to suffice. And having the courage to go outside your cave, outside your boundary, or outside of the Shire, to make a reference to that, but to go outside of your comfort zone and do something new implies a certain amount of courage. It implies that you're going to want to get to a place, maybe conceptually, not physically, where you have the ability to predict your outcomes, which means you're going to start relying more and more on science, because science really is the highest level that we can have of understanding something. Science is our best means of querying nature. It's how we ask questions about nature. We use science. So the more you go out of your cave, the more you're going to evolve with science. And I think, to pick up on what you're talking about, I would say that's what you said means to me. We become more and more scientific.
And by doing so, we need to employ technologies that augment our senses. Because if we want to be truly globalized, a globalized society, we need to have an understanding for what this means, globalization. And maybe this is one of the reasons why we are having such a hard time to come to terms with climate change, is because it is beyond our cognitive grasp. Now, if you remember Carl Sagan's legendary feat with the Voyager, turning it around and producing that beautiful little dot, pale blue dot image for the first time, and also, of course, the Apollo photo. For the first time, we were able to get that grasp of who we are. But maybe we need that a lot more in a lot more detail at the moment. Because, yeah, I'm talking too much. But does that make sense to you?
Yeah, a lot. Your approach to this is very, I would say, human, in that what we're exploring really here is ourselves. If you look at how things are unfolding at COP26 in Glasgow with the UNFCCC and the mechanisms that we're trying to put in place there to do things, it may not be the favorite, I don't know about favorite is the right word, but it's not the perfect approach, but it is the best mechanism the world has to address our problems. And really what gets in our way is ourselves. We get in our way in terms of the way we interact, in terms of the way we share information, or the way we approach the definition of problems. And I'm a very big fan of science, and we really need to approach this with a scientific method, which doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, but if to maybe try and put it in more human terms, interaction between ourselves, interaction with your environment, interaction with each other, interaction between each other to address a common problem like climate change or debris in space, has to be based on an objective reality. An objective reality is key to making important decisions. We can't be arguing about what's real and what's not real. We can't do things that are based on purely faith or a personal truth. Science, by definition, implies the ability to predict an outcome repeatedly. You can predict an outcome. If I do this, this will happen. And we are faced with a lot of challenges, as we can all see in media right now, about how belief comes head to head with fact and science. And it, unfortunately, will cause a delay that we don't have. We must, there's a place for belief, there's a place for faith, there's a place for your own personal convictions, and they're all important. But personal truth versus a scientific fact, we must be able to discriminate. And the best way to do that, I think, is technology, scientific method, and working together to use those tools to address global problems. And these global problems will not go away while we debate the exact way to address space situational awareness, space congestion. While we debate it, the debris and the congestion and the misuse of space does not slow down. It actually keeps accelerating. And while we debate what to do about climate change and what's the right approach, the climate change and the warming of the planet continues in spite of all that. We cannot ignore things will continue to progress and not necessarily, in this case, in a positive way. So hence we must agree and take action based on some reference point. And for me, that's science. And to bring it to a head, what I'm inspired by was the Japanese contribution to the conference in 2018 that talked about Society 5.0, where the humans were at the center of an information-driven society, as opposed to information being at the center of society. Let's put humans at the center of an information-driven society, and that will empower us to make good decisions.
Beautiful. Now, how can space technology, space science help mitigate that problem? So in how far can everything that's going on in the new space scene, on the new space scene, help mitigate all this that you just mentioned?
We monitor our planet from space. We use space, and we have great companies that are already flying Earth observation satellites and taking images of the Earth, multispectral images, synthetic aperture radar
So you work
images.
with those companies, so you're partnering with those companies?
Not necessarily. Our services would be useful to them in navigating their satellites, but NorthStar will eventually, in its business plan, once we've launched our space monitoring satellites, we have a plan to launch an additional fleet of Earth observation satellites using hyperspectral imagery that will look at the chemistry of the Earth and make sure that we are managing with very well contextualized information impacts through pipeline monitoring, ocean monitoring, the clean water monitoring, agriculture monitoring, forestry monitoring. All of these things are fundamental. But we do already, I think to stay on your original question, we do already monitor the Earth from space. We have a lot of Earth observation satellites that deliver that service. We've got government and private sector doing that. And these are fundamental for us to be able to do the best we can to manage our natural resources. And so what I like to say is, with NorthStar bringing information to the fore, The Economist, I think a couple of years ago, said the world's most valuable resource was data. And I like to say that the world's most valuable resources is our natural resources. It's worth over $125 trillion a year to our economy, and probably more than that if you really did the math. And so we should use the world's most valuable resource, data, to protect the world's most valuable resources, which is our environment in space and on Earth. It's all part of the same ecosystem. We live in the universe, lives in us. We're inextricably linked.
So you just mentioned that there are, of course, most of us know Earth observing satellites, like most of them, of course, observe something here on Earth. But on average, like there are bazillions of satellites, smaller, bigger ones out there. What do most of them do?
It's really down to I would call it critical infrastructure. These are critical infrastructure services, monitoring the Earth, monitoring our natural resources, providing communications, supporting our economic backbone, and delivering essential services through satellites. how we communicate, how we interact with each other, how we exchange financially, how we run our commerce. It's really, satellites play a critical and fundamental role in all of that.
Who gets that data? Because if we go back to the climate change topic we just talked about, that applies to the average human being. Because the average human being out there, you and myself, we are also voters. And we vote our decision makers who should make decisions now at COP and wherever. So the question is, do we as voters already see what Earth observing technology provides? Or is that still limited to different targets?
I think more and more to the average person, that's the part where companies like NorthStar come in, contextualizing the data, meaning taking what we would call the heavy lifting, processing the raw images from space, either looking at the ground or looking at the Earth or looking into space. The heavy lifting, the algorithms, the software, the expertise, the PhDs in hyperspectral imagery, in data processing, in data science, and artificial intelligence all coming together. If it was just raw data from the sensor, you're taking us back actually in time by describing in that way to say, that's what early satellites did. We delivered the raw data to a government research house, and some very intelligent people figured out what it was saying. As you mentioned earlier, we're becoming more and more sophisticated. The more we make that, the results of those observations or the information that can be extracted from those observations available to a larger group, now instead of having one person saying, hey, there's a problem, you've got billions of people saying, hey, there's a problem and I want to help. I think the biggest thing for me in terms of inspiring, you start to think locally, think globally, act locally. I have 6 kids, so how do I inspire my children to feel like there's hope for them, for their generation, given all the challenges that they're facing? And they're not simple ones. And the best way I can think of is to empower them with technology and tools that help them feel like I can get out in front of the problem. I can get out in front of this situation. And I think information is a huge part of that. And I think that's where my focus is. And that's where I think a lot of organizations are focused on that as well. And the more that do that, the more we contextualize the data and make it easier for people to access, the more it's a case of you don't have to be a satellite expert to manage your crops. You just have to look on your phone or the screen in front of you in your tractor and say, this is the right way to apply the fertilizer and not too much of it. And this is the right amount of irrigation for this part, or this is the way I should monitor the forest, etc. It all becomes natural, like the way we use our GPS when we get in the car and just say, okay, I want to go here. And you get what you need in the form you need it. That's the big heavy lifting part that I think we've evolved from early space days, October 4th, 1957, when Sputnik went up, to where we are now.
So who is NorthStar's equivalent on Earth? Maybe, do you have a historic equivalent, or is there something similar on Earth that people have heard of, will understand, and help them understand what NorthStar does in space?
I think on the spot, the best answer I would come up with is in the 1950s, I won't get the year exactly, you drove your car. You got in your car and you drove it. There was no Highway Act. There was no rules of the road that everyone had to follow. There was no speed limits. There might not even have been lines on the road. You just drove, and you can see where that's headed. Generations later, you've got, not that much later, you've got in the UK, they started the first air traffic control, and air traffic was necessary. And then it facilitated that safe growth of that industry and enterprise. And so the equivalent, I think, is anything that, maybe throwing the question back to you, I can't think of a specific example of using information to work your way out of a non-scalable scenario. It's not scalable to keep growing the number of cars on the road if you don't have better information about how we're going to manage where the cars are going and where everybody is. And neither is it for aircraft, neither will it be for space. We want it to be automated. We want it to be achievable in a seamless way, I think is the right word. So using information seamlessly to facilitate safe travel and safe exploitation, if you like, of our finite natural resources. I can't think of a specific example, but those concepts is really what I'd rather give you than in a specific case.
Sure. So you're doing the heavy lifting in the background so that consumers, users have it easy, have an easy everyday life experience for whatever they do. So if they want to move from A to B, they take a look at their smartphone and they get their instructions. But there's a lot of heavy lifting going on in the background. So, of course, this is something we know, but there's a lot more that we may not know and that your services do in the background. You said that you will be deploying your own satellites in the future. Who do you work with at the moment? So where does the data that NorthStar uses come from?
The data that we're going to use will come from our satellites that will be launched in 2023. Mm-hmm. Right now, we demonstrate the capability of our algorithms. We built the algorithms and built the software and built the services before we launched the satellites so that it would be readily available once the satellites were launched. So we've been demonstrating this capability in international events, which started out by being organized by the US government called SAC-T, Sprint Advanced Concept Training, where they looked at very creatively how they could do a better job of processing and working and dealing with information on objects in space. And we were invited to participate in that. The first, I think, non-US commercial enterprise to get involved in that in 2019. And we used that as a test bed, as a learning experience, as a way to gather information about what challenges are being faced globally. And that situation has grown significantly over the last couple of years. This month, in November, actually next week, NorthStar will be supporting a cell, because what they did was they developed the SAC-T to the point where they put cells all around the world so it would go continuously. It started out initially only in the US or in North America, supported by various organizations, and now they've grown it around the world. So there's a Meridian cell that covers Europe, and then there's an Asian cell out in Australia or Japan area that covers that part of the world. And so they can continuously monitor around the clock and run exercises. So in next week, we'll be, as part of NorthStar launching its Luxembourg office, we will be doing a demonstration of SAC-T in the Meridian cell in Luxembourg. That's where we demonstrate our capabilities. That's where we learn and exchange and develop and highlight our skills and refine our products so that we can then work specifically with clients in terms of how they can ingest that into their system. And so there's an adoption process so that clients can get a full appreciation of what they're doing. If you think about it in maybe a separate example, a guy who's running, or a person, I should say, who's running hundreds of thousands of kilometers of pipeline doesn't really want to know how a satellite operates and what is hyperspectral imagery. The person operating the pipeline wants to know, do I really have a leak? Where is it? And should I shut down the pipeline? And so that's contextualized information working at its best early enough so that the leak doesn't cause significant damage and fallout. Sure. So this is the whole concept. And incorporating information services like NorthStar's into pipeline operations, forestry management, agriculture management, et cetera, water management, oceans monitoring, spacecraft monitoring, doesn't happen overnight. You don't just say, oh, download the app and you're good. There is a training and adoption process that is inevitable. Maybe as we evolve, we'll get much better at it. But at this stage in our evolution technologically, it requires a certain adoption. And so we focused on that as part of our business model to develop that before we launched the satellites. Because once you've launched a satellite, you've spent a lot of money. You spent a lot of money, sure. and you're stuck with the fact that you got to pay the rent on that satellite, and you don't want to not have clients. You want to have clients that are ready to go. So we work very hard at preparing the clients before we launch.
But of course, there's at the moment satellites out there that observe the Earth, that observe pipelines, if you want. So what is the difference with your services on top of that?
Yeah, it really goes into the electromagnetic spectrum of wavelength. And so you start, which means how much can you see? You and I And everybody who's ever played with an optical device like a VCR or whatever, which is old technology, but if you look at the back of a large device, instead of an HDMI cable, you might see an RGB cable, red, green, blue. We essentially see in three colors, red, green, and blue. If you expand those frequencies or wavelengths to cover a broader scale, which is all of the spectrum, or not all of it, but a larger part of the spectrum, you get into a zone which we refer to as hyperspectral. So hyperspectral imagery creates the ability to create if you like, a chemical signature. In every different spectrum band, you have a different intensity. Oil has a certain signature, and different types of oil have different signatures. So when you catalog or create a library of those signatures, now you have a way of detecting the chemistry of the surface of the Earth. And hyperspectral imagery is a tool to do that. Hyperspectral imagery isn't exclusive to NorthStar. It's the ability to process that information and then turn it into a usable application for key components of the challenges we're facing, like I've already mentioned: agriculture, forestry, water management, ocean monitoring, pipeline monitoring. So we use a hyperspectral imager, which is 240 wavelengths. And then you're talking about what ground spectral density will you have? What's your GSD? What size pixels will you cover the Earth in? And the combination, and then the revisit rate. How often will you revisit a location? If you revisit a location once every 2 weeks, for some applications, that might be fine. You don't worry too much. But in other applications, you want to see it once a day because you don't want to allow the situation to get worse. So configuring but now I'm talking about system of systems, configuring your system of systems solution to deliver that is a challenge, and a business challenge as well as a technical challenge. And so what's the most important challenges we need to face environmentally, and where's the business and where could it be benefiting from? And then developing your system and launching it so that it meets that. So we already have in place quite a few contracts in the areas that I've described before, working with either private industry or government on developing apps that they can use and from the hyperspectral images. And right now what we're doing is flying hyperspectral imagers on aircraft and collecting data and characterizing what they want us to characterize, and then developing the heavy lifting algorithms and the tools to be able to deliver the end service downstream.
So who's your typical customer for those services?
Civil government, Coast Guards. We announced a contract with the Canadian Coast Guard to monitor sensitive wetlands, because typically when an oil spill happens, unfortunately, it's almost hurricanes. They seem to hit and hit the most vulnerable areas. We're looking at forestry. In Canada, forestry is managed by the provinces. So the provinces of Canada manage their forests. So we work with provincial folks on forestry management. We work with private industry on agriculture. So we work with private industry on pipeline monitoring. It's a large pipeline operation here in Quebec that we work with to develop applications. And we do a little bit of work with the Canadian Space Agency through a program called Smart Earth that looks at fusing data from multiple sources. So in all of the cases of NorthStar, we will have our own data that we generate from our satellites. But it's also, maybe to touch on a theme we've been referring to peripherally, the ability to fuse data or to ingest data from other sources, which people might consider to be our competitors. But I'm saying it's your competitor if you want to dominate the market. It's not your competitor if what your purpose is to solve a very important problem about climate change and how we're going to feed the Earth and how we're going to protect space. So co-opetition, I think, is the theme for the future, and getting out of each other's ways and figuring out how to piggyback and leverage other people's capabilities so that it's not win-lose, it's always win-win. And everyone makes money because it's important to have these services. I think we'd be happy to spend billions of dollars a year, not just on NorthStar, but on the concept of protecting our environment. And if we're doing that, now we feel a little bit better about where we're headed.
I'd like to rewind a little, because I'm starting to understand the wider potential of your services. How can space technology help us come to terms with the most pressing problem, and that is climate change on Earth?
Right. So climate change affects many things. If I go back to my definition of it being a system of systems. Climate change can be caused or is caused by excessive or over emissions of greenhouse gases. So we have, starting there, commercial systems and government systems that monitor a greenhouse gas and greenhouse gas emissions. So satellites that provide that service, and they deliver to both government and commercial users. The impact is on the quality of water, the availability of water. It affects crops. It affects potentially infestation of crops because things start moving differently because it's a system of systems, and species that didn't normally occupy certain areas now can. And that brings with it different types of challenges, infestation. How are we going to monitor all of that? And that's when you get into the concept of NorthStar's concept of hyperspectral imagery and looking at the chemistry of the surface of the Earth and being able to deliver necessary information early enough so that people can get out in front of these issues and either mitigate it on the ground or identify it as a trend and say, look, we need to do something about this in advance. And so
the NorthStar satellites, they have a wider spectrum of visibility, or vision, that is, in fact. So it's not just the optical spectrum that our human eyes can see, but
right.
Those satellites go beyond that. And why and where's the advantage in that?
It really is. If I gave a simpler example, but it's not exactly mapped one-to-one, but I'll use it as an example. If you were talking to your doctor, your medical doctor, through Zoom or through an app like this, and the doctor said, hold still, Marcus, I just want to take a picture of you, and I'll tell you whether or not you're healthy. You'll say, okay, I got a good picture of you. And you'd say, okay, you're healthy, Marcus, you're good. Or he says, Marcus, what we're going to do is we're going to send you for an ultrasound. And then after the ultrasound, we're going to send you for an MRI. And we're going to do a full top to bottom check of you so that we can be sure of what you're doing. So I don't want to be too oversimplified, but the concept is if you're working in RGB or if you're working in a low number of bands or panchromatic, you can take excellent pictures of the Earth. And those serve purposes that you can easily and quickly imagine. You've watched enough Jason Bourne movies to know that pictures help services. When you're talking about environmental services or dealing with the challenges that we're facing in the environment, you don't want a photograph. You want an MRI. You want to know what's going on with that crop. And it's so powerful that the farmer could be standing in the field holding the corn in his hand saying, looks good to me. But the hyperspectral imagery would tell you, you have a disease, you're infected. You have something you can't see because I've done an equivalent of an MRI on your crop. And it's not your entire crop. It's this area of your field. And the rest is okay. So now maybe you can cordon it off. Now maybe you can take action. Now maybe you can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I don't want to say it's that simple, but information is the enabler. And so that's why we came up with our motivational or our massive transformational purpose of NorthStar, which is using information to empower humanity to preserve our planet. If we inform people and we give the right information, people can make good decisions in real time. And we can play to their natural, and I don't mean this negatively, selfish tendency. If I protect my crop, if I protect my spacecraft, if I protect my pipeline, I'm protecting my business. And by doing so, you're protecting the environment. It's a nice outcome. If you protect your pipeline as well as you can with this great tool,
it's not leaking methane.
You're protecting the environment. But you're thinking about it as, well, I'm not losing revenue from my pipeline. But what you're also doing is raising your social license to operate, because now people will say, hey, they really monitor their pipeline. It's very reliable. They never have spills bigger than this much, whereas they used to have these massive spills, but they don't. And so this is where, and I try to be objective about it, even though it's impossible in the truest sense of the definition objective, but it's not just NorthStar. It's the concept of using information to be able to achieve these objectives, which is, I like your concept, the evolution of humanity. The more science and information we have working in this way for us, the better our chances for survival. We are about sustainability. We are about protecting our planet. We are about giving us a good chance and hope for a better future.
How does the farmer get hold of that information? So how does that work? Would you then like lease an app to that person, or how does that work?
What you're really doing is selling the information service to the tractor manufacturer so that these are seamlessly provided to the people who buy the tractors. They just have the best tractor technology. It goes out there and monitors your crop and gives you advice on what's going on. And so the subscription information service comes as part of your tools that you use to manage your crop and manage your asset. And so it would be similar in that, how would you embed that into the pipeline monitoring system? It would be more the case by case with the client to say, I have this system that I use to monitor my pipelines. I need to embed your information into my information flow. So normalize the data, give them the tools through an API or a RESTful API so that they can bring it into their system, and then let them manage their new level of information. I have so much more information about what's going on in my pipeline now, I can manage it a lot better. And I don't know anything about satellites or anything about data fusion or anything. I just do it.
So where is NorthStar different to what, for example, Planet.org do, or other services that have their satellite constellations that observe the Earth in different spectra and whatnot? So what's the difference in your services?
I would say it gets blurred very quickly, but the major differentiator is the types of sensors and the configuration, the concept of operations, we call it in space. How does your system operate? How do you, what type of sensor are you using? So what kind of data are you extracting? How much work did you put in to convert the raw data into easily usable data? How much heavy lifting did you do? How frequently did you visit each site? The frequency, the communication system you have for relaying the data so it all happens in real time, the delay, everything. All of that comes down to a system of systems of operations. So without getting too far into the weeds, there's different systems of operations or concept of operations that NorthStar has. We start with hyperspectral imagery. You have interplanetary links for the data to come down faster. You have high-speed processing, which they have, but you have the ability to process this data in near real time. You have apps already developed. You have a user platform to interface, and then you make it available.
So if we go back to the first photo of Earth taken from the lunar orbiter, I think that was back in the 60s. That was Earth in all its glory, a life-changing and maybe humanity-changing vision. But now, what you do with hyperspectral imagery and imaging is that you're augmenting that vision of our planet, because there's more than meets the eye to our planet.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I tend to wax philosophical about the reference you're making when you think about the first time Apollo 11 turned around from the moon and looked back at Earth and said, "Wow, look how small and look how fragile the whole thing is." And I'm very big on the experiences and the wonderful experiences I've had internationally and having exposure to different cultures. Japanese culture, I worked with a Japanese firm for 10 years and went many times to Japan and learned a lot about culture and their culture by interacting with them and working in the United States, working all over the world, getting a chance to go to Russia, Israel, Arab states, and also particularly a lot of work I did in France. I really, truly subscribe to having a philosophy of what you're trying to do with your business. One of the hardest things that I had to deal with when I was taking my MBA courses was that we were pounded into our heads, your job as an executive, as a CEO, as a future CEO, is to be concerned about quarterly profits. You got to show a profit and you got to show growth every quarter. And my natural environmental or non-conformist personality said, but how can that always be the most important thing that I have to do? And I don't need to say that I'm the only person that said that, but for me it was jarring. And look at the world we live in now. having that been our driver, and people say, you know what, that wasn't necessarily the best driver to encourage companies for specifically and only quarterly growth. Growth of a company is important, but not at all costs, not at the cost of the environment, not at the cost of social or responsibilities to humanity. It's not. And so I think we've lost the way there a little bit. And I think information services, and coming back to that's important. My philosophy is very much from taking my kids across Canada and also all over Scotland, camping. There's 2 rules in camping. You must respect nature because nature does not respect you back. And you must leave the campsite the way you found it. So when you talk about the image of space, when I was born 3 weeks after a young man named John F. Kennedy went to Rice University on September the 12th, 1962, and said, we choose to go to the moon. And we do this not because it is easy, but because it is hard, and because it will bring out the best in us to be able to achieve this task. And that's the same challenge we face right now. What we need to do is do things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. And what NorthStar is trying to do is something that's very hard. We're trying to change the way we interact with our environment so that it's more sustainable. And we need to do it right now. And we need to learn from our mistakes, and we need to learn quickly. And we need to cooperate, and we need to cooperate well. And we need to help each other. And we need to do it immediately and openly. And I was somewhat encouraged with what I saw in the news recently coming out of COP26, and that they're admitting the fact that vulnerable nations need to get more help to cope with the deadly impacts of global warming. And we have to help each other. The enemy is ourselves. The enemy is our ability to cooperate with each other. And so my philosophy is along those lines. And I think the more we embrace that, I believe that's my philosophy. And so I go back into belief rather than science, right? You have your own beliefs, but I believe that if we embrace that type of a philosophy, we'll have a much better chance, and we'll give our future generations a much better chance of having a prosperous future. Well, certainly the campsite in space ain't the way it was when I was born. It was pristine. There was, very few satellites flying around in space. And then now look at it. It's congested. And we really got to clean up the campsite.
What do your kids say to their friends on the playground what their dad does?
My oldest is 32, so he's saying it to the.
Good.
He's saying it to the kids he teaches on the playground because he's a teacher. God bless him. But I think what my kids say is, impossible is just a word. Like Muhammad Ali said, impossible is just a word created by, excuse the time, but he said, well, he could change it, say created by small people who have small vision, who don't believe in making a difference. And impossible is really nothing. And I've hopefully inspired my kids to all believe that, because that's a fact. Impossible is just a word, and we need to inspire people to do better. And hopefully with this type of thing, and not just NorthStar, but just that whole approach, we give generations to come a much more bright future.
What will NorthStar be once all your dreams for the company will have come true? What company will it be, and what services will it offer to its clients, consumers?
It'll change the way we see our environment. It'll simplify the challenges that we have to face in terms of being sustainable and environmentally responsible, and it'll be accessible to a much wider audience than what we have right now. And by doing so, it'll become integrated into the fabric of the way we do things, like your cell phone has. Because I was playing around and doing business before there were cell phones, and when they came in, it was like, oh, look at this new technology, and look what it does now. And NorthStar will become embedded in our way of life, and it will be a much different organization than what it is today. And I will no longer be the CEO. I will be watching it from a distance, saying, "Look how that beautiful thing has grown," because it really needs to have a good life and a long, but in staying in the philosophy. And so my role for now is to create it and to get it standing up, but my role is to instill in it the tenets that I believe in as part of my philosophy, and hopefully pass that on safely, as they say in the Montreal Canadiens dressing room, from the poem that was written on Flanders fields in the First World War: "From failing hands we pass the torch." So we pass the torch to the next generation, and we want to pass something good.
That's right.
So that's really hopefully what NorthStar will be.
It could be an interesting service to help us down here on Earth better understand what the Earth feels like, by making it not only visible in its geospatial form, like it is visible on Google Earth, Google Maps, but making it visible in its health state.
Mm-hmm.
So why not make the Earth visible at its fever scale? Or why not make the Earth visible in its, emotional state? So I don't want to be too esoteric here, because this is a scientific place. So maybe emotion and Earth don't go together. Maybe fever, because one can measure temperatures. But this could be something that could maybe produce a live picture of the place we live on, and help us understand, or maybe help us better help the Earth stay a healthy and safe place for us.
Agreed. I can't help but say that the image that you planted in my head, it was the mood ring of the Earth. We're going to create an Earth mood ring, which I think is fantastic. It sounds like something out of an Austin Powers movie. But I think spiritually, there's an important component of us all feeling connected. I think if we can do that through science, so that we feel that we're connected at least to the information, and then at a different level, we're connected because the information matters to all of us. I think your concept is valid, and I like it.
Wonderful. Stewart, please give us your Space Café espresso for the mind. Please do take the liberty to share something you think could be an inspiration for our listeners.
Not hard. Being a Canadian and having grown up in the 70s, I'm a huge fan of Joni Mitchell. And she didn't make it to Woodstock, but she wrote the definitive song about Woodstock. And in the lyrics, she says, "We are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden." And I think those words from Joni Mitchell are so inspirational, so visionary, so impossible to duplicate in her poetry. It's just, for me, an entire inspiration and a privilege to say that I'm a Canadian, that a Canadian came up with that concept. Because we are, if you listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson, he'll tell you, we are stardust. The atoms and the elements that make up our body come from the original explosions and collisions in space, where those elements were forged and they sprinkled themselves all over the universe, and they make up us, who we are. The universe is right there in your hand. And Joni Mitchell captured it in a song. And I think, for me, if we think like that, we're all not so different. And we all have something very much in common. We all come from the same place, and we all have the same aspirations for our children, that we want to have a good, sustainable environment. So Joni nailed it.
Wonderful. Stewart Bain, thank you so much for that beautiful inspiration, and thank you so much for taking the time and being on the show.
It's a wonderful experience. Thank you for having me.
I don't want to ruin this moment with too many words. Thank you for being with us today, and please consider rating us on your favorite podcast platform. Goodbye fellow travelers on this beautiful spaceship.
I came upon a child of God walking down the road, and I asked him, "Where are you going?" And this is what he told me. He said, "I'm going on down to Yasgur's farm to join us."